if you will, religious economy, which means different religions can compete with one another, which is a good thing, not a bad thing. And if that's allowed to happen, what you discover is that the best of religion rises. In the same way that in debate, the best of reason rises. In the same way that in science, if it's open and it's not closed, and we know now what happens with science when it's closed off, in science, if it's open, the best of science flourishes. That's a human characteristic. It's not a religious characteristic. Whereas if you take people and you give them power and you cloister them and you let nobody watch them, they're going to do bad things, whether they're in government, whether they're in church, whether they're in universities, whether they're in any institution that gives people power and doesn't give them accountability. But you know that accountability in the religious tradition is not only accountability to people around you, it's also an accountability to something greater. And when people take that seriously, it changes their lives. It is rare, in my experience, for someone to have any kind of conversion experience and become a worse person. Think about it. Think about the people you know who have become religious. Has it made them worse? One of Mr. Hitchens' countrymen, Wurl, who was not a very nice man, was a devout in his way, Roman Catholic, and when someone asked him about it, he said, "You should see what I would be if I wasn't a Roman Catholic." His instinct was that, in fact, it civilized him despite the fact that he wasn't a very pleasant person to be around. And it's not true, and I will repeat this again because there's a certain persistence in misquoting what I said about this or attributing to religion in general what it doesn't say. It's not that you have to have the book to know what's right. That's not the issue. Nobody thinks that all of you are morally benighted and only if you open whatever book, whether it be the Book of Mormon, the Quran, the New Testament, the Hebrew Bible, you'll know. Let me tell you what the Bible is, at least as my tradition understands it. Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was perhaps the premier Jewish theologian of the 20th century, said the Bible is the chronicle of God and human beings searching for one another. That's what it is. It's not a basket of divine fiats tossed down on your unwilling head and you have to do everything it says. And that's not a new insight. Heschel documents it all through the writings of the rabbis. It is a struggle to discern what God wants in this world. And because we're imperfect creatures, we will discern it imperfectly. And yes, in any system that seeks to do good, any system, I don't care what it is, whether it's Congress or moral philosophy or religion, the easiest thing to do is to come before a group and say, let me show you all of these failings. Because after all, you're working from no baseline. The question is, what would the world have been for the past thousands of years if there was no religious striving to do better? And if you believe that it would have been better, then I think you believe in the face of the 20th century, which was by far the bloodiest century in human history, the most degraded, the cruelest, and the one that systematically expelled religion, not only from the public but also from the private sphere. The only place where churches were burned all over the world because God was going to be replaced by the deification of human beings. And the deification of human beings is the most dangerous conclusion we have. I say sometimes to the teenagers in my synagogue, I say, look, when you were 2 years old, you couldn't possibly imagine what it is to be a 15-year-old, right? You don't know what a 15-year-old is. When you're 2, it's not just that you misconceive what a 15-year-old is, you don't even know how to think about it. In our tradition, God is much greater in proportion to us than we are to 2-year-olds. So when I say that God is the intelligence behind all this, to whom I can connect and from whom I learn through the mediated teachings of religious traditions what it is I'm supposed to do in this world, Mr. Hitchens can call that deist, but I call it religious humility. I call it an understanding of the fact that even though I feel God as a constant presence in my life in my best moments, it doesn't mean that I have a lock on what it is that God wants me to do at every moment. It's why I tell people all the time that I'm not here to argue Judaism's superiority, I'm here to argue its excellence. Because I don't accept the false opposition that Mr. Hitchens offered you before, that either all traditions are true, which can't be possible, or none of them is true, or only one of them is true. I would tell you instead that religious traditions are animated by the same intuition that there is something greater than ourselves to which we can relate, that is both personal and impersonal, that can motivate and move your life and make it better. And though that central intuition, which is what God wants of us, that central intuition gets expressed in lots of different ways. It gets expressed in books that are written in lots of different ways. It gets expressed in theological doctrines that are different. But all of us share that intuition. It was shared by Socrates. It was shared in some ways by Spinoza. It was shared by the Jewish tradition, the Christian tradition, the Muslim tradition, the Mormon tradition, on and on and on, traditions east and west. I'm not asking you whether you believe that the Catholic Church has done a good thing in saving people who did terrible things. Everyone agrees. I'm not asking you whether you believe that religion does only good in the world. Everyone knows that's not true. It's a childish argument, and it's an obvious one. I'm asking you something deeper. The question is, does God matter? I'm asking you whether you share that intuition that there is something inside of you that is transcendent and connects to something transcendent. And I'll close with this. There are reason arguments, and then there are personal arguments. I'm going to take an extra second just because he did, in the midst of my seconds. I know that religion does terrible things, that some of its doctrines are broken, that some of the people who practice religion are hypocrites. But I want to tell you something else that I know, as deeply as I know anything. A few years ago, when I sat in a cancer ward, and I was bald, and I had a line in my arm, and I was getting poison pumped into my veins in the hope that I would live, I knew that I wasn't alone. I wasn't angry, and I didn't think, why is this happening to me? Instead, I hoped that I would get better, but really, what I prayed for was courage and acceptance and strength. And the sense that there was a presence in this world beyond and above the people whom I loved and who loved me. And that moment, no matter what anyone else, my redoubtable antagonist or anyone else tells you, that moment is precious, is important, is a central experience of the human being and the human soul. And if you know that moment, and if you have felt it, don't let anyone, by any rhetoric, take it away from you. And if you have never felt it, leave yourself open to the possibility that you will feel it one day. And don't let the tricks of your mind close the opening of your heart.
With my tiny interjection, I was only trying to save the rabbi time so he wouldn't have to borrow anymore. My challenge, I hope you'll remember it, was he had to name an ethical statement made or moral action performed by a believer that I couldn't replicate. And he mentioned instead an oratorio, the Messiah, and unspecified religious poetry. I would have picked, I think, the sonnets of John Donne myself, or maybe George Herbert. No, wait, just now you said that was your, yes. You are saying to me, in the presence of this congregation, sir, that I can't help bring food to the hungry, because I don't believe in God. Of course you're not saying anything so preposterous. I give my money and my help to organizations like Amnesty International, Doctors Without Borders, Human Rights Watch, Oxfam, and many others who do the work of famine relief and inoculation for its own sake, and not to try and convert or proselytize, and who do that work very well, and often in the face of priests of all kinds who say, don't bring your children to be vaccinated. It's an old trope among the religious. It's an interference with God's work. You'll go blind. Your children will die. It's a constant struggle against superstition out in the field, I might add. And yes, I give blood. I enjoy doing it, as a matter of fact. It reminds me of my old socialist days. After all, and I also have a very rare blood group. So I have an